This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast with historian Stephen Ujifusa. Business, history, and culture with a nautical twist. Today on the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast, I'm happy to have David Thayer as my guest. David Thayer is the executive advisor at the Blackstone Group and a co-founder of Harvest Fund Advisors. He is the owner of Watch Hill, a 1930s home in Flourtown, Pennsylvania, the subject of a history by Travewin's History entitled The Castle, a jazz-age story of fortune, aspiration, and forgotten architectural genius. A veteran of the U.S. Army National Guard, he served as captain of the 1st Troop Philadelphia City Cavalry, founded in 1774, and the oldest military unit in continuous service to the United States of America. He received his bachelor degree from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, a master's degree in international history from the London School of Economics, and his MBA from the University of Chicago. David Thayer, thank you so much for appearing on Wet Lunch on the High Seas.
Thanks, Steve. Happy to be here.
So tell me about your upbringing and education. You are from the Philadelphia area. You've always had a mind for business, but you also have a deep passion for Philadelphia history and architectural history, and you've been able to blend all of these interests together. Can you tell me a bit about your background?
Sure. Well, insofar as, I guess, the appreciation for both architectural history and business goes, my mother and father were so different and yet so similar. They're sort of opposite personalities. My mother was very expressive. My father was sort of taciturn. He grew up in sort of an affluent setting. My mother, not so much. And yet they really instilled in all of us, I was one of 3 kids, the youngest of 3, an appreciation for American history, for beautiful settings. And, they weren't especially affluent, but they did what they could to foster in us a sense of both what was right in terms of behavior and social norms and things of that nature, a strong faith, and also what looked right. So I think they were very careful to surround us with things that were beautiful and historical. And I think when you're mired in that brine as you grow up, it stays with you. And then as far as business is concerned, I just kind of wanted to do the best I possibly could. So I applied to the University of Pennsylvania, and I remember there was a box on the application, and you could apply to the College of Arts and Sciences or the engineering school, and which I guess may still be called the Moore School of Engineering. Nonetheless, the nursing school, and then this place called Wharton. And I just kind of checked the box because it looked like the business-friendly school, little knowing that Wharton had this reputation, and that, frankly, it would be kind of difficult once I got there. But yeah, that's kind of how it all kind of came about. And I think that, it's still kind of wired into who I am right now.
So when you showed up at the Penn campus, you threw yourself into a lot of activities. You obviously worked hard in your business education, but you also took an interest in what was going on at Penn Design, now known as Weitzman School. And you began dipping into some classes there. Can you tell me about your experience with some of the teachers there and sort of the design world?
Sure. So at the Wharton School, you actually didn't have to take all your classes in the Wharton School. In fact, you could take up to 80% of your class in Wharton, as I recall, at least when I was there. But you only had to take 50% of your class at Wharton. So, because I had this sort of patchwork of interests, I took full advantage of that. So I took exactly half my classes outside of Wharton. And my strongest passion was, as you noted, architectural history. So I especially was intrigued by a class called The City, which was very famous at the time, run by a guy named Thompson, whose first name I've forgotten. But nonetheless, each class would feature a visitor from local politics or the local city planning scene or an architectural historian or an architect. And so I got to meet and avail myself of Ed Bacon, who was a well-known city planner in Philadelphia. Ed Rendell, who was then the district attorney, later mayor of Philadelphia and governor, came to speak. I later took a class, graduate level class with Ed Bacon. got to know him a bit. And then a couple of classes with George Thomas, who was kind enough to be interviewed by you for the book that we'll later discuss. But for those who don't know, George Thomas, now at Harvard, was an expert on Frank Furness and William Price, designer of your very own house, Steve. And at the time, while I was taking a class with George Thomas, and by the way, these were all, as I remember, graduate level classes. So I was just kind of the interloper from Wharton. I mean, it was I was definitely the only guy from Wharton in these classes. And George was at the time helping restore the Lee Library, now called the Fine Arts Library, perhaps something else. And that was the old main library of Penn, since supplanted by Van Pelt, which was built in, I think, the 60s. But Lee is just this grandiose Victorian era furnace masterpiece. And he was telling us stories as they were going along. And one of the things I distinctly remember, which may be a bit of a tangent, but probably of interest to you, is that they had no idea there was this massive atrium in the library at the time. They were just kind of dismantling what was there and trying to figure out what was underneath all the accretions over time, and discovered that now famous atrium is still intact. I'm sure they saw it from old photographs and so forth, but I remember him kind of barging into class one day and saying sort of like, "We found it, it's there." And then parenthetically, I took a couple of classes with Digby Baltzel, who was a bit of a legend at the time, still is. And, the interesting thing about George is that, he took a great interest in the social implications, or I guess I should say, like how architecture reflects culture and society, and not only the times in which that architecture is built. So, I remember this is all news to me, but you can certainly still see it. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Describe how in various towns, you can kind of tell which church is which, because, it's probably no secret that oftentimes the original settlers tend to be Anglican or Episcopalian, so they had more money to kind of throw around, so they would have the nicer churches and so on and so forth as you go down the social scale. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And so, once the then poor segments of society would build a church, sometimes they wouldn't use authentic materials, so they would build there'd be like a still pillar in the middle of the church. It would be painted to look like marble, whereas in the nicer churches, there would be actual marble, things of that nature. I just found all of that just absolutely so fascinating. And then, after Penn, I went off to London, and there's London, with all its gorgeous architecture, and then finally got my graduate degree in business at the University of Chicago. So I got to sort of immerse myself in all that Chicago has to offer, sort of the epicenter of modern American architecture. So anyway, that's the long answer to your short question, but yeah, there it is. That was my introduction to all that Penn and the architectural world had to offer at a young age.
And you showed up at Penn just when this sort of late Victorian architecture was being appreciated again, because in the 50s, you had sort of, and we'll talk about this with the architect of your house, Harry Sternfeld, there was kind of a clearing house of a lot of design schools in the 1940s and 50s of the classicism of, say, Dellon and Aldrich and McKim, and White. A lot of these old Beaux-Arts people were sort of thrown out, replaced by the international style. And there was a huge disdain for this late Victorian architecture, as exemplified by Furness's library. I think there's a famous story of Frank Lloyd Wright being shown around the Penn campus, and I think the current dean of the architecture school said, "Oh, that's an old piece of junk. We're going to tear that down." And Frank Lloyd Wright dramatically points his cane at it and says, "That, sir, was designed by a true artist." What did you sort of see of this reappreciation of this style of architecture and what it said about Philadelphia at the time?
Well, it's funny you should ask. I had zero appreciation for sort of the newer, more esoteric forms of architecture. When I looked at the Furness masterpiece that was Lee Library and is Lee Library, but then also some of the other structures that he built around town. And then furthermore, once I was taking classes in it, it was very easy to appreciate a Trumbauer or Price or a Furness to the untrained eye. And even lots of older stuff that is not built by such famous architects. The organic architecture that just kind of pops up throughout the city, I just thought was just phenomenal. And, over time, you do begin to appreciate the Frank Lloyd Wrights and the more modern architects like Louis Kahn. I remember, by the way, that as a freshman, I was in 101 Brooks, which happened to overlook the medical library, right, Steve, at Penn that Louis Kahn had built. And I knew it was a famous building, but I just could not figure out like why everyone thought it was so special. I later came to more fully appreciate some of that stuff. But you're right that, Penn was a melting pot for all of that stuff. And I'm sad to say that much as I thought Ed Bacon was a really fascinating character and just an absolutely great guy whom I kind of revered at the time, he was, of the school you just described, which was just kind of tear everything down. So I'm sorry to say he tore a bunch of furnace buildings down in his bid to kind of make Philadelphia more uniform in a sense. And there were probably some triumphs embedded in what he sought to do, but the destruction of that old railroad station across from City Hall, which he engineered, is just a modern day tragedy. And what's interesting, this got some attention while it was at Penn, is that, Ed Bacon was a Quaker, and Quakers don't like ostentation. And so, the thinking was do not break the gentleman's agreement to build higher than City Hall, right? That was kind of prevailing at the time. And that's a very Quaker ideal, right? Everything's kind of equal and the same. And so all the heights were essentially the same. They went up to something like 40 stories so as not to breach Billy Penn's hat. And this notion of equally sized blocks throughout Philadelphia, which was, Penn's famous plan for the city, is a very Quaker notion, right? Everything's exactly the same and very equal. In fact, it's my understanding that William Penn was sort of upset when that grid plan was inevitably broken up with little alleyways and so forth, which is just, a reflection of human need. So, you did have furnace, and you also had the Ed Bacons of the world kind of, in tension. And sometimes one school of thought was ascendant, and other times the other school of thought was ascendant. I happen to be a fan of that more ebullient architecture and that more organic kind of approach to not only architecture and city planning, but life. And I think it makes for a more interesting city to have these varied styles than to have something that looks very uniform. But you're exactly right. What an interesting city in which to grow up.
Well, yeah, Furness, he grew up on a very plain row house on the 1400 block of, I believe, Pine Street. And his father, who was a famous Unitarian minister, I think inspired him as a kid. He was a friend of Ralph Waldo Emerson's to sort of rebel against the sort of Quaker plain uniform, sort of the row house. Right. And Furness's architecture, he was also inspired by, I think, heavily by his time in the Civil War, where he saw things weren't all neat and orderly. Things were ugly and scary. And also he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for Valor, very un-Quaker to do that. Right. And I think his attitude to life was kind of like, you only live once, live boldly. And he did in his architecture. And he inspired a whole generation of architects, disciples who sort of decided to not conform, very un-Philadelphia. But let's get to your house, which is kind of a product of the Philadelphia school. Furness never went to architecture school. He studied in the atelier of Richard Morris Hunt, who was a pretty well-known Beaux-Arts architect. But in those days, late 19th century, there was no formal architecture school. You learned by doing. But Furness spawned a number of protégés, including Louis Sullivan. But his work at Penn influenced the creation of the architecture department. Paul Philippe Cray took over. And then you had Louis Kahn come out of that, who was one of the few modernists who remained faithful to the Beaux-Arts tradition and to the human scale of architecture. But then there is a whole host of other architects who came out of this late 19th, early 20th century, who on one hand used classicism, but also blended arts and crafts, and Norman, Tudor. And one of them was a gentleman named Harry Sternfeld, who was originally from Atlantic City, New Jersey. He came from a Jewish family that had converted to Presbyterianism. He went to Central High School and then went to the undergraduate program at the University of Pennsylvania. And Harry Sternfeld designed, he didn't design many homes. He was mostly a professor at Penn. But tell me about how you came across your house, which was built in the late 1920s and was one of Sternfeld's few residential commissions.
Yeah, that's right, Stephen. Just a couple of remarks before we explore that topic. One is that you were humble enough to have glossed over the very podcast that you just aired, describing Frank Furness's man cave, and how that actually is sort of a reflection of his personality. And so I would encourage everyone listening to this to listen to that as well. And then, I think the house itself is a bit of a mashup, and we'll get to that momentarily. But as you were describing Harry's ascendance within Philadelphia just now, I was thinking, like, it's kind of a classic Quaker/Philadelphia story. I mean, it's my understanding that in Boston, which is not uncommon, probably New York too, but certainly Boston, the architects were sort of to the manor born, and there were sort of these class restrictions. Whereas, and Digby Baltzell talks about this famously, like Puritan Boston, Quaker Philadelphia. Whereas Quaker Philadelphia, being more open to aspirants, is a place where a guy like Harry Sternfeld could thrive and really kind of be his full creative self. And so, I think that's reflected in the house, but just a bit about how we found the house. So Laura and I were recently married, and we had been looking around for, an architecturally significant house, to be honest. I mean, not necessarily one that was quite so grand as this one, but just a neat old house is kind of what we had in mind that we could, restore. And, we weren't frankly swimming in money at the time. So we were looking for one that was also affordable. We put letters in the mailbox of something like 50 different local house owners, just asking if they might have an interest in selling. And we got exactly 0 positive responses. We got a handful of responses, all of which were negative. And so we were kind of surprised by that. It took us 4 years to find this place. We knew it was on the market and had been kind of languishing on the market, frankly, because I think nobody wanted to take something like this on. And so, as our prospects were improving and the houses prospects were kind of moving the opposite direction, those two lines eventually intersected, and we were able to scoop it up. And the house itself was in a state of sort of benign neglect because nobody had kind of run through it and done the usual Philadelphia thing, unfortunately, which is to like tear it down to the studs and modernize it. It was thankfully pretty much intact. I mean, it needed a lot of work, but all the fixtures were pretty much in place. And, I would say something like 80% of the old touches were there. Because I think some of the prior owners just didn't really have the wherewithal or the inclination to do a full-scale overhaul, thank God. And so, it was pretty exciting to us. So that's kind of how we landed here.
Well, as soon as you purchased the house, you began learning more about, not the architect at first, but you were very interested in the guy that built it, a gentleman named William Morris, who attended the University of Pennsylvania. He was heir to a jute fortune that was made in the 19th century by his father, who was a Canadian immigrant. So Morris was kind of both an insider and an outsider. I think he grew up in Overbrook. And he attended Penn in the 1890s. He was a football player. He was known as lawless, disorderly, and bald-headed. Definitely a character. But he was kind of like a Tommy Lee Jones, and he played football, but also acted in the Mask and Wig Club, which was definitely a big contrast from the football team.
Your fellow Harvard man.
Exactly. He was roommates with Al Gore. He did not overlap with my dad. My dad's a little bit older, but yeah, I think that Morris was kind of this kind of late 19th century collegiate type that was pretty common at the time, but he was a businessman. After he graduated, I think he served in the Spanish-American War, and he was a cricketer. And he and his wife moved to Chestnut Hill after he graduated and took over the family business. And then in the late 1920s, he and his wife decide to build their own house, which they named Balinor after it was an amalgamation of the names of the three surviving children. And what did you find so interesting about this character? I mean, this man who commissioned this house that is, on one hand, has one foot in the sort of Tudor Norman Revival style, but also, thanks to Sternfeld, and there were other architects doing this too, like Delano and Aldrich in New York, who played with both Art Deco and traditional styles. Like, what did you begin finding interesting about this guy?
Well, I didn't know much of anything about Morris until after we'd moved here. And then a member of his fraternity sent me a bunch of material on him that he had found in the Psi Upsilon archives, Psi U, by the way, being known as the Castle at Penn, which then became the title of the very book that you wrote, Steve, because there is this kind of double entendre when it comes to the house itself, because it looks like a castle, and yet the guy who commissioned it was a member of the castle. But what I also, once I was kind of reading about his time at Penn, I found entertaining is that indeed he was called lawless, disorderly, and bald-headed, which pretty much described my own time at Penn, and including the bald-headed bit. But, I think a couple of things. One is that the architect and the owner were probably perfectly matched. I mean, both in terms of their backgrounds, sort of on the margins of Philadelphia society, but both successful, were well matched. But I think it also gave Sternfeld license to do his thing, because on the one hand, I suppose Morris could have wanted to conform and fit in, but it seems like he was more of a mind to, make his own statement. And it certainly seems like he gave Sternfeld full reign to be able to do that. And, I failed to mention earlier about one of the things that we find so attractive and found so attractive when we bought the house is that, the views are phenomenal. They were especially neat when we first moved in. There's a little development nearby that's since been built, but just as far as the eye can see, there's just not anything in sight. We have an adjacent golf course here. There's a quarry nearby. There's a very famous property called Erdenheim Farm that's nearby. And so essentially no real development of which to speak. A couple of old houses that date back well over 100 years. So they're kind of pretty. This clubhouse owned by the cricket club is also very pretty. So it's not just the house for us. It's certainly the views. I think perhaps even the views more so than the house in some respects. But anyway, the house and the owner, I think, were perfectly suited to each other in terms of their backgrounds and this sort of conflicting but pleasant tension among various styles, both traditional and yet not so traditional.
I mean, one of the most amazing features of Watch Hill, which is the name that was given to the house in the 1940s by the Tamarin family when they bought it, and you've retained that name since, your children aren't named Bill, Alice, and Eleanor, so it's probably unlike the original owners. But
we thought about having extra kids and renaming everybody to be in keeping with the house.
Yeah, well, I think, it's. I was like, what is the origins of this name? It's sort of this made up name, and I'm like, oh, I saw the names of the kids. I'm like, oh, that makes sense.
Exactly.
But yeah, one of the amazing features of this house is that it looks like a Norman castle on the outside, but then when you go up to it, you see it. There's kind of a more playful side to it. Just there's not a whole lot of ornamentation on the outside, except for how the stone is laid. It's a very intricate, and according to a story, Sternfeld saw how the stone was being laid. He didn't like how the light was playing off of it, and they asked him to redo it. I mean, he had that attention to detail, but it wasn't like the sort of grand flourish over decoration. It was like, no, it was the details of the decoration, which in many ways is very modern. But one of the most amazing details of the house features is what is now your dining room, but it was originally a living room. And it has this beautiful cypress paneling with the hand-painted stenciling on top. But it has a projection booth in it. And it almost strikes me as it's almost like a 1930s movie set. It was not designed for sort of formal entertaining in the Gilded Age way, but kind of almost like a cinematic feature. And it seems like there's this sort of dramatic flow that runs throughout the house. There's not this kind of if you look at a traditional house like Ardrossan, everything is symmetrical and there are all these rooms that are set up for very specific purposes. Can you sort of speak to the layout of the house and how it speaks to you in that way?
Well, a couple of things. One is that, the interesting thing about, we'll call it federal architecture or Palladian architecture, is that, it is very symmetrical. It's so pleasing to the eye on the outside. And then you get inside and everything's very symmetrical, and I would argue perhaps a little bit boring. So I've always probably had a weakness for the arts and crafts style, the manner in which this house was built, even Victorian architecture. Yeah, because it is asymmetrical. I think that's what gives it character and interest. And certainly this house fits into that mold. So it's kind of erected in this sort of semicircular fashion. It's sort of like an arc. And it's actually somewhat skinny as you walk through it. So there's very little depth. It's like one room wide. And as I mentioned, asymmetrical. So lots of little interesting kind of moments and touches and experiences throughout the house, which I love, absolutely love. Still discovering new things all the time. And then, as we recently learned, Steve, because as I recall, Morris was a stonemason, like a member of Masonic Lodge, an actual stonemason. He had incorporated into it a bunch of references to the Masons, and one of the things I had discovered a while ago is that it's oriented exactly north. And then furthermore, as you know, Steve, I recently discovered just within the last month or two that the balcony here off what is now the office on the second floor exactly matches the pond in terms of its shape. It's sort of like half of a stop sign, which I had never noticed before. And then it's also exactly parallel. So if you get down and look over the ledge of the balcony, it exactly matches the orientation of the pond, which itself, because it matches the orientation of the house, is oriented exactly, I guess it would be south. And so things like that just kind of continue to blow me away. So it's one of the things I enjoy about the house, and I think not reading too deeply into it, but I will anyway. That too, not only is the exterior a reflection of what we were just describing in terms of the architect and the owner, the interior it's just this cavalcade of different styles. And, you're describing the dining room and its cinematic feature, which we discovered once we moved in with the screen and the projection room. The house itself is theatrical. And then, as you know, it was also home to, just by sheer coincidence, but nonetheless, it's only fitting, theatrical cast members, right? So the cast of The Music Man were here, Robert Preston, some others, which I love because it was our family's favorite musical growing up. Leopold Stokowski, as I remember, at least members of the orchestra, perhaps Eugene Normandy, were here. And so it has this sort of theatrical quality about it, which is really interesting and very unusual.
Yeah. So, I mean, the original owners, the Morrises, from what we get the sense, because the record is scant, they didn't stay there that long. I think they might have lost a lot of money during the Depression. But this other family that was also both on the inside and the outside of Philadelphia, Bernard and Bertha Tamarin, they bought the house in 1942. He was an inventor. He was an alumnus of Episcopal Academy and the University of Pennsylvania, but he was from a Jewish family. He bought it, and his wife was a pianist, a musician, and they hosted these wonderful parties in the 1940s and 1950s. And I get the sense that, Susan Barron, who's the daughter of the Tamarins who helped us out with this project, she also sort of said this house, she said growing up, she always referred to the house as a she. She felt it was a living thing, which really struck with me. But it seems like this house has a history of really entrancing a lot of owners. And Sternfeld, unfortunately, suffered the fate of a lot of architects who are trained in this style, in the sort of Beaux-Arts manner, and that he was eventually let go from the University of Pennsylvania in the 1950s and died in relative obscurity. But what I find interesting about him is that, in contrast to a lot of what we call starchitects today who would say, here's my vision, live with it. Like Le Corbusier would impose his vision on, say, the city of Paris.
Right.
Or Frank Lloyd Wright would say, everything you own is junk. Get rid of it. I'm giving you a house. Here's the furniture. Here are even like the ball gowns the gowns you have to wear at dinner. Like there's sort of this control thing about it.
Right.
Sternfeld, on the other hand, seemed to have been like a lot of architects of his time to say, okay, my job is to work with the clients to produce the house that you want. Can you sort of speak to that sort of attitude? We ended up using that quote on the back of the book from George Thomas about how a good architect has to produce what the client desires as much as he wants or she wants to produce.
Exactly. And I'm so glad that we talked to George Thomas, my old professor, while pursuing this project. And it was his quote, as you mentioned, that's now on the back of the book. But he had also written a book called Drawing Toward Building, which features Harry Sternfeld. Speaking of intersecting threads, and because Sternfeld was known as the human camera, he was known for his drawing and so forth. And it's a tragedy that he died in obscurity because he was so talented. But I am absolutely 100% in favor of the more responsive approach to architecture. And, Wright famously at Falling Water was like, no, the balconies need to be farther out. And the construction worker was like, no, that's not tenable. And now, decades later, they're having all these problems with the balconies. And so you need to listen to your not only owners, but contractors. And furthermore, it is the client's house. They're the ones who have to live there. I remember I.M. Pei and Society Hill Towers apparently would only allow, when it was originally built, the window shades to go either all the way up, all the way down, or halfway up. And the people who live there were like, what the heck? Like, the architect gets to bug out and, continue with his life, whereas the rest of us, the punks who were stuck living there, had to contend with these shades that would only go up a certain amount. And so eventually that was changed. But I really can't stand that dictatorial approach to architecture, much as I may admire, the byproduct of some of their work. So thankfully, we happen to live in a house, built by a guy who seemed to have been interested in what the client had to say. As mentioned, some of the Masonic touches were incorporated into the house. And yet Sternfeld could kind of be himself and, had this fancy what is now dining room or build what I now call gratuitous chimneys. Like the chimneys are probably twice as high and as big as they need to be. All five of them work, but it's kind of a source of ongoing mirth that they're quite so enormous as they are. But I think that was just Sternfeld having a laugh and having some fun while he was building this thing. It looks like a really grand house from the outside, but I don't know that was necessarily the intention. I don't think it was necessarily meant to be a statement house. It was more just, let's have some fun in this moment in architectural history when we can incorporate different styles and not feel beholden to any one style and let the human mind flourish.
Mm-hmm. No, it's interesting. I think that, as George Thomas said, during the sort of cleaning house of the 1940s and 50s, I think it was Thomas who said that the international style, which was pioneered in Philadelphia with the PSFS building of Howe and Lescaz, which is a magnificent work of architecture in its own right. I mean, the attention to detail is incredible. But it seemed in the 1940s and 50s, it was like, okay, here is the definitive style. This is the end of all architectural history, is brought to us by Le Corbusier. And he said it was kind of an import of elite Northeasterners from France to America and saying, here it is. This is it. Gropius came in too from Germany. But I think the sort of, my opinion at least, is the flaw is that the thinking it goes from a style to the style. And I think for the next 50 years was seen as the only style. Yeah. And are we sort of going to enter a phase now in current thinking where, okay, you can have good modernism, you could have good traditionalism, it can coexist. You don't have the sort of either or binary. And my hope is that that's what'll happen. I don't know if it will.
Well, it really touches a nerve because I cannot stand, you see it in architecture, but you also see it in other disciplines that this sort of like, let's erase the past, let's create the new man, let's institute our utopian vision. It always ends in tears. We have 100 million people who were killed by communism in the 20th century, aspiring toward this ideal as if we can kind of like, create a new order. And what we ought to be doing instead, I think, is tapping into the creativity of all that each individual human has to offer. And yeah, it's going to result in lots of different, in this case, architectural styles. But so what? This is great. We get to, just walk through Chestnut Hill. Yes, it was built originally in sort of the Cotswold style, but now it's this cavalcade of different styles, and that's part of the beauty of it. By the way, speaking of Chestnut Hill, I know the owner of High Hollow, which was George Howe's personal residence and studio. And apparently Howe was sort of ashamed by that absolute masterstroke because he had fallen in love with this modernist import. And of course, was a co-designer of the BSFS building. And I think that's, probably the premier example of the very phenomenon that you just described. The elites were trying to impose this new order on the rest of society, and really talented individuals like George Howe kind of fell for it and wanted to kind of dispense with the past. But I think we users of that architecture, we kind of mere citizens, would much prefer something that's aesthetically beautiful. And if you love modernist architecture, have at it. But please don't destroy what came before. And one of the tragedies of living in Philadelphia is because there is so much architecture. By the way, George Thomas used to talk about this in class. He would say, there's so much good architecture here that we take it for granted. And as a result, I think we're far too inclined to just tear it down. And a lot of this craftsmanship could never be replicated, as you know. I mean, I don't think, no matter how much money we had to spend, that some of the touches within this house, similar to many of the houses in the area, could ever be replicated, sadly. So, we really need to very carefully appreciate and preserve what we have. And our attitude with this house has been not only to restore what we have, and we're not, by the way, pouring money into fancy stereo systems or fine arts. If you've seen our furniture, it's not all that grand. But we would choose to instead spend our time and resources just investing in the house itself. By the way, we're about to put a new roof on. And so we have the option to install like an asphalt roof. But of course, we're not doing that. We're opting for slate instead because we're slaves to the beauty that is this house. And so we're going to spend the extra money to do that. But I think it's, it's a worthy investment. We knew what we were getting into when we bought this thing. And so rather than, build a house with fancy stuff, we're instead kind of investing in the structure itself. And by the way, I should mention as well, it's not just about the house and restoring it. It's also about, using it. Like if we have this enormous house, we don't need all this space, only three of us, but we want to use it for whether it's a church function or a fundraiser or just, entertaining people because we have this neat old place. It's about also using it and making it sort of a living, breathing organism, not just, some kind of museum piece. Let's all tiptoe around this thing and make sure nothing gets ruined. So I think it serves both purposes.
Well, maybe that's sort of one thing that both traditional Beaux-Arts architecture like the Breakers and international style modernism kind of share in common is they're not exactly kid or family friendly. Everything right. In an international style house, everything has to be absolutely clean and perfect. And
right.
In a Richard Morris Hunt house, there's too many things for kids and teenagers to break. So there's kind of like this, maybe the arts and crafts movement and this sort of, decorated modernism, as George Thomas and David Brownlee call it, actually is more kind of a nice via media between the two, between these approaches of everyday living.
Well, I forgot they called it decorated modernism, which is a term I love. George Thomas, by the way, this is another thing I happen to remember. He would take us around town and you could see how ornamentation gradually was removed from various buildings. There's a building which at least used to house the chemistry department at Penn on 34th Street across from the Lee Library that has one little ornament sort of bolted onto an otherwise modernist building. It was sort of the last gasp of the ornamentation that had decorated buildings since time immemorial. But I love that term decorated modernism. And furthermore, I also love the term you just used, via media. And that's, I think, essentially what it is. It's a living vessel, and yet it's also a really special place that deserves, attention to to keep it up. I should mention, when we moved in, it reminded me a lot of East Berlin. I was privileged enough. You mentioned earlier I went to London School of Economics. I went there in 89 to 90. Okay, so I was studying international history, sort of the post-war order is what specifically I was studying. And while I was there, the Berlin Wall fell down. So we got word of that during a retreat at Great Windsor Park, made a beeline for Frankfurt, and then drove into Berlin via one of the access roads. So actually I have a chunk of the Berlin Wall that I was able to get myself as I was straddling the top of the wall, East German border guards like pointing their AK-47s at me, the whole bit. And but afterward we went through Checkpoint Charlie, went into East Berlin. What's really striking to me is that whereas West Berlin had been kind of razed to the ground after the war and built anew, the socialist side of Germany didn't have the money to do that. So all the old architecture was essentially still there, but in awful shape. But nonetheless, it was there. And that's a bit like it was like when we moved in. Like, it needed a lot of work, but it was still there. And the sad part, which I had mentioned earlier about so many Philadelphia houses, especially in recent years, they've just been kind of torn up on the inside. And so we're just so grateful to have that. And at every turn, we're just sort of like, even if the house itself is not exactly to our liking in terms of functionality, our bias is uniformly in favor of just keeping it the way it is, because we do recognize it for the, I think, masterpiece that it is.
Yeah, I remember in my interview with you and Laura a while back, she said something similar. Said, well, at the end of the day, we need to honor Sternfeld's vision while still making it our home. And once again, it's sort of threading between the architect's will. But I don't think, from what I've read about Sternfeld, he doesn't seem to have been a particularly authoritarian or difficult character like a lot of other architects.
Right.
But, he clearly worked very closely with the client to provide something he wanted.
You had mentioned this earlier, and it also occurs to me just now that, I think, too, that this, we keep using the term mashup, this mixture of styles that you see reflected in the house, which was a reflection of the time of the moment and of the client himself, is, I think, possibly a metaphor for the current moment. You had mentioned now that we've kind of come to be at peace with these various architectural styles, not only in the Philadelphia area, but I think just broadly, people appreciate different styles and don't feel the need to raise everything to the ground the way they once did maybe 50, 75 years ago. But this could, maybe I'm just being Pollyannish, but this could also be a metaphor for the moment in that, the style here is so disparate, a little bit discordant, and, the style more broadly throughout Philadelphia, is sort of a mixture of different styles. And yet when taken together, Chestnut Hill is a good example of this, as mentioned earlier, it does kind of form a coherent whole. So, a lot of people talk about how our country's so divided right now. And of course it is. But by the same token, I'm hopeful that even though there are these different strains of thought and many of them are in conflict with one another, that there may, in fact, be a coherent whole to emerge from this.
No, I hope you're right. I think you think of like, an area like Chestnut Hill where you have these, beautiful homes designed by a lot of prominent architects, but then you have the Vanaventuri house, which itself is a landmark of, that was what the PSFS building was, sort of the first postmodern house in Philadelphia, where it's a pioneer. I don't particularly love it, but I understand why it's important. I think you sort of have to look at something that you don't necessarily like and be like, okay, I understand its significance and why it's important, and how that house is now very much a part, in many ways, because it is different of the Chestnut Hill. I think there are a couple of Louis Kahn houses that are also part of it, and not too far away from you is the Corman House, which is one of the last, I guess you can say, it's a modernist house, but it's designed in the Philadelphia country house manner. So I think you do have things that sort of grow out of each other. But any other surprises you found while owning this house? And then we'll turn to a couple of your other activities that are in the Philadelphia historic firmament. Any other surprises that came with this house when you owned it and have been redoing it?
Well, we didn't know, as I mentioned earlier, that much about the house when we bought it. But I will say that we were blessed that the Tamron family were such sound stewards of the house. You're aware that Mr. Tamron was absolutely maniacal about honoring Sternfeld's vision. He didn't even want, as you probably remember, gutter spouts incorporated into the house, functional as they are, because that's not what Sternfeld had wanted. And so I'm afraid to say that we've bowed to modernity and we've installed copper gutter spouts. But nonetheless, I think that there's that. And then furthermore, even as you and I have walked around the house, like we'll just discover little touches that I just never noticed before. And one of the things that's really neat and interesting and really makes me admire Sternfeld most is that there's so many flourishes that were totally unnecessary. I mean, you'll go around the corner and you'll be like, oh, well, they didn't have to have all these angles here, but they did it just because they were having fun and allowing their creativity to, reach its full potential. So I think the process of discovery is ongoing. And even, for instance, you mentioned earlier that little theater. I mean, like, we didn't know that was there. We just happened to see a crease in the cypress paneling. Like, what's this? And discovered a camera. And then we later saw the screen and so on and so forth. So I think, that's probably the discovery is ongoing.
Now, one of your other interests, aside from architecture, is you're very involved in the military. You were captain of the 1st Troop Philadelphia City Cavalry, which is itself an historic institution, and you have served abroad. You were a platoon leader in Bosnia. Could you talk about just sort of how the military and your service to this country has informed your view of the world, and yes, whether it's related to the troop or not the troop?
Sure. Well, I'm sure you've already gathered that, this abiding interest in history. And so while I was at Penn, I was invited to visit the troop's famous armory on 23rd Street. And by the way, the precursor to the current armory was designed by Furness. Perhaps you know that, on 22nd. But yeah, I walked in, I was just like, okay, I feel like I found my home, because it had, to me, so much to offer. I'd already had an interest in military history and serving in the military. I'd looked into ROTC at Penn. So it offered that. But then furthermore, it's the oldest continuously active military in the country, certainly the oldest cavalry in the country. And in fact, we just celebrated our 250th anniversary a few weeks ago. So it actually predates the country, and the troop standard is a precursor to the American flag, and that it contains 13 stripes. And so, I don't know, there's so much about it that really spoke to me. So, I kind of rose to the ranks from private to sergeant, and then got my commission, became a lieutenant, and then, as you mentioned, served in Bosnia, and then eventually was tapped to be captain after serving in a different unit for a number of years. And yeah, it really has become sort of part of the fabric of my life, although, pretty naturally so. It's, it can be a pain in the neck at times, but it's so much in keeping with, I think, the way I was raised and the way I'm wired, that I am the troop and the troop is I. It's just wired into kind of who I am. Although, as you know, I have a real appreciation for other historic institutions in the area. I'm sort of involved in some of those as well. And even our church, St. Thomas, is right around the corner here, goes back to 1698. And one of the Revolutionary skirmishes took place on its grounds here. Overlooks Captain Morris's property, Hope Lodge, by the way, Captain Samuel Morris's old property, as I understand it. So, yeah, it's just a really neat city in which to grow up. And I'd spent time elsewhere, as you know, and I lived in D.C. for a time, in addition to Chicago and London. And so many Philadelphians come back, right? It's like moss to the flame. And I found myself doing that as well. And here I am, and I really enjoy it here. Sounds like you do too.
Well, unlike you, I'm a transplant. I'm from the New York area, but I've been here for 20 years. My wife has been here for 10. She came here for fellowship at Children's Hospital. So we're fake Philadelphians, but my kids are born and bred here.
Yeah.
They even, they love the Eagles. My wife and I are kind of, couldn't, we're like kind of take it or leave it, but the kids love it, love the Eagles. But yeah, I think that, Philadelphia is also a city with, a lot of these old institutions which, flourished from the Revolutionary era through the time the city was the capital, through the late Victorian era, and then declined during, post-war 1950s as the city's fortunes changed. But would you say that, and we're sort of seeing this throughout the country. I mean, there's a lot of talk about the decline of these third spaces, these institutions that are neither home nor work, that people have sort of lost a sense of connection. Do you think we might be in a period where there is more interest in these institutions? Some are new, some are old, but are very strong in Philadelphia, people looking for community.
Wow. Well, thankfully, I was sort of in my prime years, the prime of my youth, I suppose, in the 80s when interest in such things was reemerging. So while I was at Penn, people would go to every football game. We'd sing the old fight songs. All this stuff was percolating back to the surface after some dormancy following the social upheavals of the late 60s and 70s. And so I think that's kind of continued to the present day. And yeah, this is so Baltzellian, the notion that, Philadelphia used to be sort of aristocratic, now it's meritocratic and more open to the integration of various cultures. And I think that's been nothing but positive. And he would argue the same. Philadelphia is more open to it, arguably, than Boston was, but nonetheless still sort of had these encrustations. And so, yeah, I think the current moment in Philadelphia is a pretty special time. There's renewed interest in these older institutions. I think some of them still struggle to survive, but nonetheless, they have a shot at life. And, it's also very Tocquevillian, as I'm sure you know, right? I mean, America, as he observed back in the 1830s, is, as you said, a place of these sort of third homes, I think is how you put it just now. And Philadelphia is just an absolute standard bearer for these third homes, right? And so they're all over the place. And you and I are both members of a bunch of them. And I see it as a real opportunity to carry on that legacy, to be a steward, to be a participant, and to engage in that continuity. Sometimes it's hard work. It often is hard work to keep these things alive. But what a privilege it is to be, a thread in that overall tapestry.
It's interesting just regarding that. I mean, I'm in a singing group, the Orpheus Club of Philadelphia, which is the oldest men's singing group in the country, 1872. But 100 years ago, there were lots of these singing groups. I mean, there's a bunch of old buildings in the Frankfurt or other parts of the city, the Frankfurt neighborhood, that were German singing societies. And guys would get together after work, some were middle class, working class, some were upper class or, across the range, but they would get together and sing leader part songs for fun. And the Orpheus Club, on one hand, was sort of a traditional Philadelphia thing, but it also was sort of a German-influenced group. And my step-grandfather was a Philadelphia German, and hopefully I know he'd be proud of me singing in this. He was in Mask and Wig. And a very good musician, but the Orpheus Club
is some of them, by the way, Steve, still exists. And yeah, I don't mean to imply that this was somehow bound to a certain class, is the old-fashioned term, but socioeconomic stratum. It was up and down the social scale throughout the country, thank God. And I'm a member, speaking of one of these German societies, something called the Cannstatter in Northeast Philadelphia, and it's great. It's been around for 150 years, and they have these German festivals and so forth. And I know a couple of the singing groups are still around. So it's great fun to be a part of things like that as well.
Well, I hope that, this trend will continue where people will look for these groups to belong to. I think it's part of a healthy society. And also, circling back to architecture, that there'll be a greater appreciation for a whole variety of these architectural styles of the environment. You cannot have these sort of. Sometimes I wonder when I look at a lot of the modern architecture I see going up, especially on college campuses, is a lot of it simply, on one hand, saying, "Oh, we're doing something new," or is a lot of sort of the what I call sort of cheaper modernism, basically an excuse to cut costs?
Exactly.
Is it
I was just about
basically an
to say
excuse to
that.
cut costs? Because I mean, you look at the PSFS building or some of Le Corbusier's villas. I don't like a city planning, but I think Le Corbusier's villas are exquisite. They don't spare cost. They use nice materials, but is a lot of it sort of an excuse to say, okay, we're just going to create something, you don't understand it, but a lot of it's just a way to save money.
I could not agree more. And I do think that it is a way to save money. And I think, across the arts, we're really suffering from a paucity of new and interesting and worthwhile advancements, frankly. But, there's hope. And I think as society grows more affluent, as I hope we will, there's more money to spend on such things. And they are investments. Cultural and aesthetic investments are worthwhile because they span generations. And just trying to cut costs and slap something on the facade of a building and call it novel is not a worthy advancement in my view. But I think there's still hope that we can still find new paths to human flourishing and creativity.
Well, I'd like to close on this thought. I was in New York recently, and New York, like a lot of major cities, like really got hurt during COVID, and New York is back and more roaring than ever. But I remember showing up at Grand Central Station and noticing all these people. The whole selfie thing can be kind of annoying, but at the same time, you see all these people standing on the grand staircase of the station, taking pictures in front of this magnificent space.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you know what? This still speaks to people, even if they're not necessarily educated anymore. Still, these sorts of spaces still speak to someone. And today you look at a station like that, sort of more traditional, a corporation would look at it and architects say, well, why are we wasting that huge volume of space for basically an atrium? We could make use of that. But
Exactly.
you look at it, and not only does it look magnificent, but as a departed family friend of ours said, he said, the amazing thing is you stand on the staircase of Grand Central Station, and you know exactly where to go. You can look and say, okay, I know. He said, unlike the current Penn Station, which is an abomination, I mean, with the exception of Moynihan Train Hall, which is, a really nice addition to a pretty ghastly space.
Yeah.
The current Penn Station, you don't know where to go. You look at the Grand Central Station, you stand at the top staircase, go, I know exactly what track to go to, I know exactly where to go because of that generosity of space. And no one bumps into each other, no one gets lost. So there's a rationality to that.
What an astute observation. It never occurred to me. I was just there a few weeks ago. And by the way, for anyone listening, you can also, as you may notice, Steve, look up, and there's a little patch that you'll find on the ceiling of that was not restored when Grand Central was restored. I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago, and they uncovered that beautiful ceiling with celestial features and so forth. And there's a little patch you can look up and see, and it's almost black from all the old smoke and so forth that was percolating up to the surface of the ceiling. And so for anyone within earshot, just have a look at that next you're standing on that famous staircase, because it really not only is a testament to the original architecture itself, but also to those who recognized how important it was to shepherd that space along, as opposed to what happened to Pennsylvania Station, which, as I understand it, also was the catalyst for the historic preservation movement that probably gained real traction around the 1980s.
Well, David Thayer, thank you so much for your time and this really insightful interview. I really, really appreciate it. Anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
It's been a great pleasure, Steve. I really appreciate your having taken an interest in this, and also for your efforts in producing this book that you've so carefully crafted for our benefit.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the work of both you and Joe Elliott, Derek George, and also my co-writer, Maxwell Fox, and putting this together. I mean, we started just before the pandemic, and then that got in the way, but thankfully we were able to get it done, and it's a tribute to the house and to the work of a forgotten Philadelphia architect, Harry Sternfeld, who should be better known. And thank you for being such wonderful stewards of a special and unique Philadelphia country house.
Our pleasure and privilege. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast with historian Stephen Ujifusa. Thank you for listening. You can expect new episodes every week. To subscribe to the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast, visit steveujifusa.substack.com.